Let's move through exactly what happened, because it kind of went from from the inaugural speech to the crescendo in the evening. After delivering his inaugural address, President Trump moved to Emancipation Hall, where he gave another speech to supporters who weren't inside the Capitol Rotunda. This time, Trump aired grievances and attacked his political rivals, saying these are the remarks he was advised to leave out of his first speech.
2020. By the way, that election was totally rigged, but that's okay. It was a rigged election. You know, the only thing good about it, it showed how bad they are, showed how incompetent, and frankly, historically, this is a much bigger event if that would have gone like it should have.
Now, the president chose to have his inaugural parade inside the Capital One Arena because it was cold outside. The raucous crowd first heard from Elon Musk and Kash Patel, who touted the imminent return of America's glory days. The president then took to the stage and used the opportunity to sign the first batch of executive orders, among them issues related to climate policy, immigration, and rolling back DEI initiatives put in place by the Biden administration. But the more consequential executive orders came last night inside the Oval Office. There, President Trump issued roughly 1,500 pardons and commuted the sentences of 14 others in connection with the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. The pardons included hundreds of people sentenced to significant prison time for their convictions of serious felonies, such as assaulting police officers with deadly or dangerous weapons. Additionally, Trump issued, quote, a full, complete, and unconditional pardon to all other individuals convicted of offenses related to events that occurred at or near the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, a category that includes other rioters who assaulted law enforcement officers. Those with commuted sentences include individuals associated with the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers who were convicted of seditious conspiracy. Some of those pardons included Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, who was serving a 22-year prison term after being convicted at trial of seditious conspiracy, a crime that requires prosecutors to prove that a defendant used violent force against the government. As the Wall Street Journal notes, the breadth of the pardons contradicted the case-by-case approach Trump and his allies had signaled ahead of his inauguration, and it flew in the face of admonitions from Republican allies who'd voiced opposition to the notion of pardoning January 6 defendants who had assaulted police. Those included his own vice president, J.D. Vance, and his choice for Attorney General, Pam Bondi.
If you protested peacefully on January the 6th and you've had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned.
Do you believe that those who've been convicted of the January 6th riot, violent assaults on our police officers, should be pardoned? That's a simple question.
So, Senator, I have not seen any of those files, of course. If confirmed and if asked to advise the president, I will look at each and every file, but let me be very clear in speaking to you. I condemn any violence on a law enforcement officer in this country.
So, Jonathan Lemire, I guess Willie said a week ago, J.D. Vance said, if you commit violence against a police officer, you should not be put out of jail. You look at Officer Fanone beaten into inches of his life, and if you just want a split screen on the pardons, because I know all of us wish that none of the pardons were necessary yesterday and are concerned about what may come in the future because of those pardons. But you look at the two pardons, the outgoing president pardoned a police officer who had the hell beaten out of him within inches of his life, felt the need to do that. And the incoming president pardon the people who beat the hell out of the police officer. So tell me, how did we move from what J.D. Vance was saying a week ago and what Donald Trump was saying about looking at these from a case-by-case basis to where we ended up last night with action so sweeping that it seems that even Republican senators are surprised.
Yeah, we're seeing right there on the screen his Time Magazine interview just after his election saying, I'm going to do this case by case, and if they were nonviolent, I think they've been greatly punished, but suggesting there would be a different category for those convicted of violent offenses. That said, let's remember his very first campaign event in this election in Waco, Texas, where the first thing he did was step on stage and appear with the January 6th convict choir. So some of this has been telegraphed all along, but it did accelerate and it grew more expansive despite what we heard from J.D. Vance just 10 days ago, despite what we heard from Pam Bondi just last week. And Trump, with he and his closest advisors, now that they're in power, decided to go big, to have sweeping pardons, including for members of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, going far beyond what even some of his closest allies wanted or even recommended here. Let's recall, of course, that some of these convicts, their sentences were handed down by Trump-appointed judges. Let's remember, of course, this is the largest criminal investigation in the history of the Department of Justice. One has to wonder what happens now to the career officials in DOJ and attorneys' offices, U.S. attorneys' offices, whether they will stay in place after this. Some of these people, there were parties last night at the D.C. jail. There were hopes that people would get out in time to attend some of the inauguration events last night. This is what Trump's base wanted, and this was what he delivered.
And let's underline that. This is what
he over-delivered.
This is what his base wanted. And in reading the news accounts this morning, you learned that after J.D. Vance said that those rioters who beat the hell out of law enforcement officers, after he said they should not get pardoned, it was J.D. Vance who got attacked by the MAGA base, saying that all needed to be acquitted. And you are right. Donald Trump talked about this throughout the entire campaign. This is what America voted for. This is what Democrats warned of. This is what Donald Trump campaigned on, and this is what Americans voted for, and it's what they got. What I'm curious about, Jay Johnson, with obviously your background and extensive knowledge of law enforcement and the dealing with U.S. attorneys, I'm wondering what the repercussions of this will be, what the impact will be.
For each one of those 1,600 cases, there's a federal prosecutor assigned, dedicated to the case, who's feeling pretty disenchanted this morning. I would not be surprised if we saw a mass resignation from the Department of Justice as a result of this. Going back to this issue of the executive orders.
That's probably
that's what
some would argue. Some would say that's exactly what the Trump administration wants.
And the administration would want, yeah.
Well, somebody's got to prosecute violent crime in this country.
Or
somebody's got to prosecute organized crime in this country. Somebody's got to prosecute terrorism in this country. Somebody's got to prosecute, bank fraud in this country. Let's not forget that. One of the problems with executive orders, and this is a nonpartisan, bipartisan statement, executive orders issued on day one of an administration, drafted by a transition team, are done so without dealing with the bureaucracy that has to then go implement them. The cabinet officers are not even confirmed by the Senate yet. And so very often there's a unrealistic aspect to an executive order signed on day one.
And let me just say, there was reporting about that last night that, and I'm going to talk to Donnie about sort of the showbiz portion of much of the day. Yeah. We always talk about trying to separate the ground noise from the signal. Most of the day was showbiz.
Right, and he undercut his own attorney general nominee by doing what he did.
Right, and obviously last night was the signal, the not only the warning, but actually
there were a couple.
There were quite a few, but that said, a lot of those executive orders, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and others, I believe, were hastily written,
Of course.
won't hold up in court, and they'll probably have to do it all again.
I call them the executive orders for the full employment of lawyers, judges, and courthouses. There will be a lawsuit associated with at least every one of these executive orders. Birthright citizenship. I learned, I don't know about you and I are lawyers, but I learned sophomore in college that you cannot change a provision of the U.S. Constitution by an executive order. And birthright citizenship has been enshrined in the 14th Amendment since 1868 to ensure citizenship for my enslaved ancestors. And it has been understood for over 100 years to mean if you are born or naturalized in this country and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you're a citizen. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof has meant that an exemption for the children of diplomats. And so that'll be challenged in court. Denying asylum will be a challenge in court.
And by the way, on that issue and on many of these issues, it ends up at the Supreme Court. And I don't think many court watchers believe that Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts, at the very least, will rewrite what the 14th Amendment has meant since right after the Civil War.
I have to believe that there is a majority of this Supreme Court who will not just overlook the plain meaning and the plain understanding of a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
So, Ali Vitale, we saw yesterday Speaker Johnson, we saw many members of the Republican leadership standing, smiling, clapping along while Donald Trump gave his addresses. I'm curious specifically about this executive order of opening the jails and releasing all the January 6 convicts, many of them who've committed violence with a fire extinguisher, a flagpole, or bear spray, or whatever it is, against police officers, many of them serving long prison sentences, now free or about to be free. How will Speaker Johnson, how will Republicans that you cover every day on Capitol Hill react to this? How will they rationalize this? Because they seem to have been able to rationalize everything Donald Trump does. Many Democrats coming out last night and saying this is just an affront to our system of justice, which is these were jury trials. Juries of their peers convicted these people based on the evidence, or many of these people pleaded guilty to the charges against them, now free. What will Republicans say this morning?
It's really the ultimate conclusion to the whitewashing that we've seen Republicans, all the way from Donald Trump down to rank and file lawmakers on Capitol Hill, do when it comes to January 6th. I mean, you show those images of what it was like outside the Capitol. We know what it was like inside the Capitol. And then you issue pardons. You contrast that with the president coming in and issuing pardons callously, as if this is not a building that still bears the scars of the trauma of that day every single time lawmakers and staffers enter its halls. You know, I had one lawmaker say to me that they were at the Capitol yesterday and they watched as the news of the likely pardons was coming through the building, and they watched as the Capitol police officers' faces fell. And certainly there is going to be that kind of a reaction within the halls of Congress. But it also strikes me that Trump was quite easily able to make good on a promise that he repeatedly made out on the campaign trail. Lemire is right to point out the way that this was always central when Trump was out campaigning, but also the fact that he stood in the halls of the Capitol and reiterated the big lie, the idea that the 2020 election was rigged, was stolen, and that's the only reason that you then had people motivated and energized to go to the Capitol to try to disrupt the certification of votes that would have certified and underscored that Donald Trump lost the election. So I think people are not shocked. They knew this was coming. But I think my conversations with sources is there was a sense of incredulity. As I was talking to someone who was a staffer on the January 6th committee, they just said, what a time to be alive. I mean, those are people who, in doing their jobs, received a presidential pardon preemptively for doing nothing wrong.